Gene Reed. He is the chairman of the Legislative Committee for Texas NARO. It's a very, very active committee. They do a lot for us. I don't know what position we would be in if we didn't have them out there working for us. So thank you, Gene, for all your leadership and your hard work. It's helpful to all of us. So with that, I give the floor to Gene Reed from Abilene.
All right. Thanks a lot, Beverly, and appreciate that nice introduction. Makes me feel real warm over here in Abilene, Texas. So, hey, I hope everybody's being safe out there. I hope everybody is utilizing their masks. You know, there's a lot of different types of nice masks out there. So we definitely want to get back to meeting in person as quickly as we possibly can. And we hope everybody's doing their part in terms of keeping the environment safe. So continue to social distance and to wear your mask, and, you know, let's get through this and start getting back together and networking as we normally do. So with that, I think most of you guys know Eric Woomer. Eric Woomer's with Policy Solutions out of Austin. Eric's been with us for a number of years and working with the Legislative Committee and Texas NARO, basically as an educational consultant for us as it pertains to state legislative issues. So he's been very instrumental in getting things done for housing authorities across the state. Helped organize our Austin Visit Day at the Capitol last year, which was very successful, and continues to do a number of things for housing authorities across the state. So with that, you know, we talked to Eric, and Eric came up with a really good idea of enlisting the assistance of one of our state reps here in Texas in the San Antonio area, and I think she's in the 120th district. Her name's Barbara Gervin Hawkins. If you recognize that Gervin name, it's because she's the sister of the Iceman, George Gervin, that played basketball for the San Antonio Spurs and currently Hall of Famer. So Eric's also enlisted the executive director over TDHCA, and Eric has gone out and put together some videos of each of these individuals talking about some of the housing issues that are relative to all of us. So with that, Eric, we appreciate all your hard work, and I'll turn it over to Eric to do his presentation and video.
Thanks, Gene. Appreciate that introduction. Hello, everybody. Sorry I couldn't be with you in person today. Hope everyone can hear me all right. I had, as Gene mentioned, I got a little slide presentation where in lieu of having an opportunity to interview these guys in person, I interviewed them separately and then cut and pasted some of the conversation into my little slide deck here. And I'll run through that, and we'll talk to them a little bit, but I'll give you a flavor of what's happening in Austin in terms of COVID response and the issues the legislature is considering with regard to housing and kind of the outlook for legislative activity. Some relevant dates. I'll even throw in a little bit of the political outlook. I won't get too political, but want to give you some sense of where I would expect things to be heading in the Texas legislature. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me, but I will go ahead and queue up this video, and then at the end, I'll try and reserve a little time just in case somebody wants to revisit some of the stuff we talk about. So with that, unless there are any questions right now, I'll go ahead and get started. And this is going to be a new effort for me. So let's see how this goes. So I'm sharing the screen and I'm playing from the start. Okay, everyone see that? Gene, got that? Just making sure it's ready to go. Okay. Policy, politics, and pandemics. It's quite an intersection we've had here. It's really changed a lot of things in Austin, as it has for you. This was already set up to be a pretty active session because of some of the issues that will be on the forefront this year. But obviously, COVID complicated that. Obviously, the budget complicated that. So we're trying to navigate a few of those things, But I want to kind of run through quickly an election outlook, some of the legislative priorities, and how the session is going to play out. And in between, I'll share some commentary from both Barbara Gervin Hawkins from San Antonio and from Bobby Wilkinson, who is a fairly recent appointee to be the executive director of the TDHCA. And he was formerly in Governor Abbott's office, and he was the policy analyst in charge of housing issues. So he was somebody that I worked with a whole lot. With that, let me jump ahead. So here's Barbara. Let's hear what she has to say as in terms of introduction.
My name is Barbara Gervin Hawkins, and originally from Detroit, Michigan. I came to San Antonio in 1980 to work for my brother, George Gervin, who played for the Spurs. Sure. And being his personal accountant after he retired, I wanted him to get engaged in the community because I know a lot of our young people are highly, look up to athletes. So that's when we started the George Gervin Youth Center. And so historically, I worked in corporate America. I worked for Ford Motor Company, Detroit Edison. And so when I came to San Antonio, it was a new arena for me. But I got involved in the community and started working in the community as the executive director of his nonprofit, which is the George Gervin Youth Center. And so we've done many wonderful things through that. And a part of those things was building housing for seniors and people with disabilities. So we've done some HUD 202s and 811s. So I'm definitely familiar with the housing environment. But as an executive director, and we did education, we did criminal justice programs and other things like that. One thing that came to my attention was the importance of weighing in legislatively. So a group of folks who've known me through the years felt instead of me supporting candidates that I should become one myself.
You were voluntold.
So, yeah, I was voluntold, And so I stepped up and was blessed with winning. And so this year will complete my second session. And if I'm blessed to winning on November 3rd, I'll go into my third session.
All right, so that's a little bit of Barbara's history. Jumping ahead, here's Bobby. I'll let him introduce himself.
Eric, thanks a lot for having me. It's nice to be able to do an interview like this. Appreciate it. I've always been interested in politics and policy. Uncles and grandfather arguing around the Thanksgiving table about it. Grandpa was a Union Democrat. He had 3 Republican sons. Made for some interesting holidays. Career-wise, I've done a few different things. I'm Houstonian, went to UT in Austin, met my wife there, and then I worked at Dell a little bit. I worked for some lobbyists. That was pretty interesting for a couple of years. And I went back to Houston, tried day trading briefly, and then worked for an electrical contractor as a project manager estimator. And I had been a summer helper before and was kind of comfortable in that world of family tradition. But my wife and I kind of wanted to come back to the Austin area, and I missed politics. I'd been a sergeant at arms in the House for Pete Laney's last term. Just
there too.
Yeah, late nights, just on the House floor. Seeing Warren Chisholm on the podium is kind of whatnot. And so I wanted to get back into it, and was lucky enough to eventually get a job in the governor's office. Not necessarily the one I wanted, but I knew I wanted to get into budget and policy. By 2014, I did in Perry's kind of last term after the last session. So it was a nice exposure, and one of my first agencies added to my portfolio to kind of help someone who had kind of too much on her plate was TDHCA. And I didn't know anything about housing tax credits or much of their mission at the time. And Tim Irving was the ED, and we became friends, and it kind of stuck with me ever since. So I stayed with Abbott's team 15 sessions. The last, at the end, I was deputy budget director. So always in budget and policy, roles kind of changed. But even though I had agencies, lost agencies, and even as deputy director, when you're not so much have your own portfolio, you're supposed to be doing other things. I always had TDHCA, and I enjoyed it. It was interesting and different. And when Tim was supposed to stay a little longer. He had promised to stay a little longer, but when he was leaving and we had an acting DD, after that session finished, Sonny Dye and all that, I kind of applied and spoke with some folks and decided that moving out to an agency would be something I wanted to try. I'm real happy that the board hired me, and I'm glad to be here. It's been a strange journey to get here, but it's, I think, a worthwhile one.
So that's Bobby. He's a really nice guy, and he's got, I think, 5 kids. He seems young for having 5 kids, and he is also he practices Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is kind of an interesting activity for exercise, but that's what he does in his spare time. Barbara, as I mentioned, as Gene mentioned, is very active in housing issues. And I want to reinforce the good work that Texas NARO members have done with regard to our days at the Capitol. And I'll come back to that later. But one of the reasons Barbara is included in our discussion today is that I think Gene and a couple of others met with her during the session as part of Texas NARO Day at the Capitol, and were impressed with her commitment to housing issues and her knowledge about these issues and her passion for affordable housing. And so, that's just a good example of engagement by Texas NARO with the legislators and the value of showing up at those kinds of events, because I think we have made a friend with her on the strength of those conversations, and someone that we'll be able to rely on during session to advance the interests of affordable housing. So I asked her where she got her passion for affordable housing, and this is what she had to say.
Well, for me, having a passion for housing came about when I saw the living conditions, particularly of low-income people. And so, in seeing those living conditions, and I'm one of those individuals, if I see challenges, I want to know how we can create opportunities and provide a better quality of life. So that's when I got engaged with the local HUD office. And I wrote an application to the HUD office here in San Antonio and was awarded two 202s, a small one and a large one, and then an 811. And so from that, from the original application to the conceptual drawings, and engaged in the financing, and I was able to add some additional local resources from the city of San Antonio, as well as from the Federal Home Loan Bank. And so we developed a project that I'm immensely proud of. And so what I realized was that, people who do housing development, some folks is in it just for the money. They're going to put up those things to just stand long enough to pass the time. But for me, I felt it was about a quality of living for our elderly and our individuals with disabilities. So from that, what I've learned is, think about today's time and people who have retired and maybe wasn't a big wage earner, but they still need a decent living place to live. So we are expanding our housing initiatives. I've done renovations on housing, and I'll tell you, I love the smell of wood, okay? Not only providing the housing, but being part of the construction brings joy to me. And so I've seen the entire process, and I want to continue that. So for this legislative session, what I'm seeing is some of the challenges that people who are engaged in affordable housing, the challenges and the roadblocks that they face. But what I love most, the local housing, Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, what I find is amenable and open for suggestions. So I think that is a great opportunity to really sit at the table with the department, along with individuals who want to develop affordable housing, and really come up with those strategies, not to make it easier, but to make it more efficient so that people who put in applications and who want to move this process are not deterred because of the bureaucracy. And I believe in not breaking down bureaucracy, but make it a little easier for people to navigate. I think that's important.
So that was Barbara. Jump ahead here. How do I do that? There we go. All right. I wanted to talk a little bit about the election outlook. And, right now, the election's in early November. And obviously, the president is on the ballot. I'm sure everyone's paying attention to it for that reason. And one Texas Senator, John Cornyn, and all 32 Texas congressional offices, as well as all 150 Texas House of Representative offices, and half of the Senate, 16 of the 31 seats are on the ballot this year. So the Texas House, and you all, of course, recall that the legislature meets on the second Tuesday of every odd numbered year, and they meet for 140 days. And so those that get elected on November 3rd will be sworn in on the second Tuesday of January to start the session. So between November and January, there's a lot that needs to get done. Not only reorganizing the physical offices so that everybody has space, but those members have to find living accommodations, they have to hire staff, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a breakneck pace just those last 2 months or so. Right now, there is 83 Republicans and 67 Democrats, and that's important because the majority in Texas elects the speaker, and the speaker sets the agenda largely, as well as names all the committee chairs. And we have a bipartisan tradition here in Texas. So even though there's a Republican majority and a Republican speaker, they name Democrats chairs of certain committees, and some committees, every committee has a split of R's and D's, and some committees have more R's than D's, and other committees have more D's than R's. So this isn't like Washington where the party runs the whole program. There is an opportunity for the minority party to have some influence. I listed a few of the key members here who are leaving. Most notable there is Dennis Bonnen, the first name. He is a longtime Republican out of Angleton, Texas, and he was the Speaker of the House, replacing Joe Strauss after he stepped down. But Bonnen got himself in a little political hot water and decided not to run for re-election. And so his seat is open, and then of course that leaves the speakership open. And it's a question as to whether or not the D's will take over or the R's will retain control. Last session, there were 12 Democratic seats gained. And this session, it takes 9 more Democratic seats gained for the Democrats to have a majority. 76 is the majority. So they pick up 9 seats, they'll prevail. I imagine that some of those the 12 seats that were picked up last time by Democrats that had a Republican in them previously, obviously most of those will be pretty hotly contested. And then there's another 10 or 12 seats that are presently held by a Republican. And the demographics have changed in such a way that it's probably a Democratic majority right now. I mentioned, like Sarah Davis there, she is a Republican from Houston, but her district is probably 55 or 60% Democratic. So she is, popular enough among both parties to get reelected. But, if it's a big Democratic year, she's always at risk. So, I listed several of the key seats there. A lot of them are in the urban areas, particularly in the Dallas area. Morgan Meyer, Matt Shaheen, Jeff Leach. But I did want to note Angie Chen Button there. She is a Republican in suburban Dallas, and she is the chair of the Urban Affairs Committee, which is the committee of jurisdiction for housing issues. And she's got a tough race this year, and she's been a good friend on housing issues, took a real leadership role on a committee that she didn't have a lot of experience in last session. So I like working with Angie, and I look forward to continuing to work with her. But it's hard to say what happens. I mean, I was in a meeting with the Democratic caucus, and they think they're going to pick up 12 seats. And I was in a meeting with the Republican caucus, and they think they're going to pick up 2 seats. So, the truth is probably somewhere in between that. My expectation is there'll probably be marginal Democratic gains. I'm not sure they'll get all 9 they need to take over, but I think they'll pick up a few. On the Senate side, we've lost Kirk Watson, and who was a very good friend on housing issues. And there are a couple of key races that are important. One is Senate District 19, which is San Antonio area. That's a Democratic seat held by Pete Flores, a Republican, who won in a special election last session. And then the Senate District 30 seat, which is Wichita Falls all the way over to like the Denton area. And that's in a runoff right now. They're in a special election. And that's got Representative Drew Springer, who's a good friend, and Shelley Luther is in the runoff with him. You may remember her as she's the hair salon owner that defied Governor Abbott's closure order and went to jail and had her bills paid by Dan Patrick, and Abbott reversed himself and freed her. So she's kind of a celebrity in Republican circles and is making a run for the Senate. Right now, it's 19 Republicans and 12 Democrats, and that's an important number because most legislation needs 19 votes in order to advance to the full House. You have to have 19 votes to pass bills. And with 19 Republicans, that typically means they could pass any bill they so chose without any Democratic support whatsoever. If Pete Flores were to lose, and who's to say, and that number dips down to 18-13, now you're in a position where the lieutenant governor can't just rely on Republican support to move key legislation. He's going to have some bipartisan support. And what that looks like, I mean, there's probably an opportunity for some carrots. There's also some opportunity for some sticks there. And so we'll see how that plays out. Lieutenant Governor will remain Dan Patrick. None of the Texas statewide offices are on the ballot this year. So you'll continue to have Dan Patrick as your Lieutenant Governor, Greg Abbott as your governor, et cetera, et cetera. But we will certainly have a new speaker. And to that end, I just listed a few names here. Some of these probably won't mean a whole lot to some of you, others you may know, but most of these are fairly long-serving members. I've listed some of both parties. Sinfronia Thompson there is the second longest serving member in the Texas legislature. She was elected in 1972. And a lot of these are rural guys. They're from all over the state. And it's just my best guess on who might be speaker, depending on who prevails on election day. And all of these are folks that we know very well and work with and collaborate with. And so I think if it's somebody off this list, we'll do fine. Couple of things about how COVID impacted your state government, and that is, they've closed the building and it's been closed since March. Typically right now we do a lot of interim hearings where people come and testify in front of the committees about key issues that they're facing. All those have been canceled. So many of the committees have resorted to kind of issuing requests for information. They just say, hey, here's the charges we're working on. If you mail us a letter in advance, we'll include your comments in the report, which is kind of a challenging way to develop consensus. Certainly fundraising is stalled, but that's sort of resumed now. And we've had a number of legislators who've been sick. They're not immune from it either. I understand that there's 6 senators who have had COVID, all of whom have recovered, to my knowledge, and I'm not as aware of as many representatives, but there are some. One of the big response tools that the state undertook to respond while we haven't had a session is budget cuts. The governor sent out a directive to all state agencies, and you need to cut 5% in the current biennium. So the biennium that ends in September, they're making cuts in the current budget. So, and as you can see here, it's covered by my screen a little bit. I'll see if I can move it. These are just some sample of the taxes that we collect in this state and how much they've declined. Notably is the oil and natural gas taxes. Those have plummeted. Hotel occupancy has plummeted. Some of these have recovered, some of them haven't. Oil and gas is still struggling, and hotel occupancy is struggling as well. So it will be a very challenging budget year, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. Here's Barbara talking a little bit about COVID and how it's affected her community.
All right. In my district, which is a historically African-American district and an elderly district, a lot of gentrification going on. So what's happening for us is naturally we're experiencing a lot of sickness and also deaths. And so that's very concerning. But we're also looking at the gentrification and we're looking at the number of projects that are happening in my district. And I'll tell you, even though some folks from the community are concerned and frightened by new projects, a lot of people are frightened by the unknown. What I've done is take it upon myself to personally educate the HOAs and the members of the HOAs, to ask them to embrace development. Let's not see it as a bad thing, but let's embrace it. But let's get in front of it so that we can do creative and innovative things. I've got a recent situation happening in my district where the neighbors are really afraid in terms of seeing the land being sold, a new development coming. And I'm saying, instead of, being frightened by that, let's sit down with the developer. Let's talk about how now they can create a gated community for you so they can improve your environment, not necessarily what you think destroy it by putting a large development in a small community. Let's look at developing streetscapes and other things and barriers in terms of that can protect you from what they're proposing to do. I want us to be more positive in our conversation in terms of how do we create the win-win. And I think that's so important, particularly as it relates to affordable housing / workforce housing. How do we create the win-win? And so when we're able to do it that way, everybody leaves with something. And I think that has to be our new model, not the developers coming in and say, I'm going to do this to your community and you don't have a voice. But they come in and say, how can we work together? How can I make you a part of this so we can embrace what's coming and we can improve your quality of life by doing something creative and innovative? And I think that's the way we've got to move.
I'm going to jump to Bobby here. He talked a little bit about the impact of COVID on the agency.
Yeah, I mean, we had the governor was gracious enough to waive a few things and using his statutory powers. One being the statement of no objection needed for a bond 4% deal. Would that be easier for developers if that was permanent? Yes. Once again, we see the agency kind of push for that. Now it's not really our place to do so. What's been different around here, the kind of collaboration. Some things have moved very smoothly because it's a building full of bureaucrats, and technically you can, with your internet connection and computer and a phone, you can do that from anywhere. We don't have much direct to client to end user interaction. We're more of a funding middleman for all types of different programs. So everything's kind of, the train's been running on time, whatnot. Kind of the ad hoc meetings, are harder to do. It's like, hey, everyone get on Zoom in 5 minutes. You can't really do that like you could if people were in the building. So there's been some informal and formal teamwork aspects, and this is, I'm sure, true for any organization that have been kind of lost. I actually come to the office for the most part. It's just easier for me. I have too many kids at home, but we've been, at pretty low staffing levels in the building. We're kind of ramping up now to try to get to about at least 25% or so. The governor's office has done so and followed suit. And as far as how we've been adapting, buying more conference call lines, go to meeting, go to webinar, Microsoft Teams for everybody. And so DocuSign, that's another thing. I want to keep that one. Yeah. I can just do it on my iPhone even. If I stop the car, open the document, okay, looks good, sign. And it's less paper shuffling in and out of my office. Easier on the hand too, just tap rather than that.
So changes due to COVID. I want to talk a little bit about the budget outlook. I know this group may not be too concerned about some of the ins and outs, but it's going to affect how the government operates, which will affect our ability to do some of the things that we do care about. Just to give you some broad sense of the flavor, we got the most recent update was in July. We'll get another one prior to session. We were expecting there to be a surplus in the neighborhood of $5 billion or so for this current biennium, so that the legislature would come into session in January with $5 billion kind of sitting in reserve. But general revenues declined almost $12 billion in the current budget, some of which we replaced with federal stimulus money. You know, there's some rainy day funds, funds they can draw. Of course, I mentioned the 5% budget cuts to try and generate a little revenue. But so we're going to, have a shortfall going into next session in the current budget of $4.5 billion, $4.6 billion. So the first order of business for the legislature will be to fill that gap, to fill that hole. And then, they'll start 4.6 lower than money they have, plus 2 years of budgeting left to do. So I think there'll be a real reluctance on the member of the legislature to tax, not only because Texas is generally a low tax state, but most of these economy sectors are struggling. And oil and gas is when the sector is struggling, you don't want to hit them with more taxes. So there'll be a certain amount of reticence about doing that. There's some places that are a little more low hanging fruit that you can raise some real money. Maybe expansion of gaming of some kind, maybe cigarette taxes, for example, or marijuana gets a fair amount of discussion. These aren't going to generate the billions you need to really close the budget gap. So there's bound, even if they do go down that road and then pass some tax increases, the likelihood that they'll need to cut some remains. And so I think you'll see some budget cuts for sure. But even if that's, doesn't affect the agency or your particular authority, it makes it a difficult environment in which to navigate, because the budget sucks up so much of the oxygen in the room in those 140 days. So it will be a challenge no matter what the budget picture looks like. So here's Bobby talking a little bit about the budget shortfall and the agency's priorities.
Conventional wisdom is like, there's going to be a budget shortfall, and with COVID precautions, et cetera, hardly anything but the budget's going to get done this next session. I don't know,
those decisions haven't even been made yet.
Right? And things could be confusing enough where things fly. And you're like, what? What is this bill? So we'll see. As far as TDHCA, budget-wise, a general revenue cut just isn't going to kill us. We're 90% federal. The tax credit program, that's not even appropriated. It's a tax credit. A lot of our single-family mortgage programs, we issue bonds. It's not general revenue from the state. We have a very few niche programs that are general revenue. Bootstrap, which is like a 40-year zero interest loan for Habitat for Humanity type construction, on sweat equity, owner builder. We have the Amy Young barrier removal program, which is handicap accessibility, ramps and maybe some bars in a bathroom and stuff like that. Lowered switches. So we do that for people's rental property or homeowners, and all that gets dispersed every year. The subrecipients that use those, Habitat especially, they like those programs. They get cut a little bit and don't get killed. It's not going to be the end of the world. It's not going to affect the larger mission of the agency. From an all funds perspective, our budget's increasing. We've got quite a bit of money from the CARES Act, community development block grants, and additional emergency solutions grants, homeless programs. So we hope most of that we can get out the door in 21. So maybe we'll be kind of flat biennium to biennium. But the general revenue cuts, whatever form they're actually going to take, it's not going to be that threatening to our mission or even to staff levels or anything like that. And then legislation-wise, what's going to happen? I mean, there's this thing in our strategic plan that for all agencies called redundancies and impediments. And we have a few little recommendations in there, and it's just kind of clean up recommendations. Big policy stuff, I don't think you'll see us, be anything other than a resource for other groups and for the governor's office and legislators. No big things on the horizon for us. We're not going through sunset. A new rep letter bill might be kind of a big deal. People will always try to make changes to 2306, our statute. I'm not sure. So IGR had an interim charge on looking at QAP, and so I know that they have been talking to folks, and there might be some changes. When people complain about the QAP, I'm quick to point out, that a lot of it's tied up in statute, and so if you want those things to change, that you go across the street and speak to your friendly legislator. So we'll see something like that. I'm sure something will be filed, and people want to tweak this or that in statute, and we'll be a resource and try to come out with a clean bill that helps everyone.
Jumping ahead a little bit here, I wanted to talk about some of the issues that we worked on last session that were priorities for Texas NARO. Of course, Senate Bill 493, which was the 2-mile radius bill, that was particularly important to Houston about developing projects within a 2-mile radius. And there was some activity on that affected Houston. One of the big ones was House Bill 1973. That was the state rep letter, where, of course, that issue cuts both ways. There are plenty of members who want to use a state rep letter to withhold it and kill projects or granted and approved projects. And there are other members who would just as soon get out of that game and don't want to be involved with development projects. They modified it a little bit. They couldn't get votes to do away with it, which is, some members have been trying to do for some time. Others have been trying to increase the value, as I said, so they can withhold it and kill a project. They modified it a little bit, basically saying if you don't get your state rep letter, you can go to your local governments and kind of work around that. House Bill 2529 is dealing with resident commissioners. Some of the smaller authorities that had converted to RAD were having a difficult time a few years ago finding resident commissioners, because if you're a RAD converted property, then your residents aren't technically members of residents of public housing. So we modified it a couple of years ago for housing projects under 150 units. This past time, we lifted the cap altogether. So now any resident commissioner, whether you're a small board or a large board, you can fill that resident commissioner spot with a voucher-based resident. They don't have to be in the public housing units themselves. So that was, I think, a good thing for authorities of all sizes. And then we worked on a bill dealing with right of first refusal, where if you're transferring the property, you had to wait 180 days to allow some other folks an opportunity to bid. And, some of these properties really didn't make sense to wait 180 days because they really weren't attractive to anybody but the authority based on how the deals were structured. So we had a bill that said if, in those limited circumstances, you can waive the 180 days. We weren't able to be successful getting that passed, but I think we'll spend some time thinking about it again. A couple of the defensive bills, as I mentioned, there's always bills that, kind of address NIMBY concerns that some legislators have. We worked to defeat some of that stuff. And then there was at least one bill that dealt with requiring air conditioning. And it was an unfunded mandate. I mean, everyone would love to have air conditioning, but requiring authorities to install air conditioning without providing the tools to generate that income, that revenue, would be obviously very problematic and was an unfunded mandate. So we worked hard to educate the members about the impact of that particular proposal on affordable housing. I expect we'll see something similar in that regard in 2021. Had asked Bobby a little bit about the issues that he was not executive director in 2019, but he was working in the governor's office during that time. And so I asked him a little bit about what the agency saw in 2019 and the impact on their activities.
The city of Houston was really interested in kind of, getting around the 2 mile rule that's in statute, or at least having a way for them to be more flexible. And they made a good pitch, I thought, that with all the money they're trying to spend from the CDBG, DR, to Harvey, and their planning and where they want to put housing, sometimes they're going to be within 2 miles of each other, especially if you're building in an up and coming urban core type area, Midtown, whatnot. A gentrifying area that's becoming less affordable by the year for people who traditionally live there. Maybe the 2 mile rule wasn't really necessary in that way. It made it a little more interesting that the governor had vetoed a similar 2 mile out a session or two before, but with Harvey and with the arguments being made, it just seemed to make sense. And for us as the department now, we just enforce whatever the statute is, right, and follow along. And when everything runs smoothly and fair and transparent, if that was expanded to other cities, so be it. But it's not something that I would necessarily, even if I could lobby, push for. I think there's other areas that could be improved beyond the 2 mile rule. For HB 1973, the kind of attempt at rep letters that ended up with a compromise type bill. And it doesn't seem to break down necessarily on a revenue line. Not at all, actually. When you poll individual members, so I hear. I thought the bill was workable. It seemed a little complex, like what the points go now to city council and whatnot, but it's a workable out for a representative who doesn't want to get pulled in. And yeah, it grants more points to cities and county commissioners boards, but so be it. Will there be a clean rep letter bill that gets rid of it? I mean, there'll be some filed. I do know. And as far as once again, we can't lobby whatever the legislature wants to do, so be it. But would it make the process easier for developers, including their partner PHAs? Yeah, to not have these other conditions that need to be met. The process for 9% tax credits is pretty rigorous as it is. Right. And so anytime you eliminate or simplify, I think that could be beneficial. But you won't see me walking the halls or testifying that the letters have to go. They work. We distribute all the credits every year, and we build some good projects, some good locations. So there's even like pro-housing legislators, very pro-housing legislators that want to keep the rep letters. Right. It gives their district an edge. It's something they can do to show their support every time.
That's kind of the lay of the land. And to that point, here's Gervin Hawkins talking about those state rep letters specifically and the challenge that comes with trying to navigate that process.
I think it needs to be addressed because workforce housing is going to be bigger and bigger and bigger because of the need. And so I like the fact of state reps weighing in, not just because I'm a state rep, but it keeps me informed and connected a lot of times your state reps are distanced from what's happening in the local community. And so, particularly as it relates to affordable housing, when you have to come to a state agency and you've got to work with that state agency, just think about it like this. If the state rep doesn't know anything about it, okay, and you're at a state agency and you have a challenge, how do you now bring that person up to snuff to make sure that they can weigh in, create legislation that can help make things happen? So I want to see it as a friendly relationship and not really even pick losers and winners. I look at it from my perspective. If several entities came to me in my district and they all needed a letter, I'm gonna give them all a letter. That way it puts them on an even playing field, okay? And then their score is based on their application, not just based on my letter. Particularly if they're good projects. Now, if someone just is coming and is gonna build something that's not acceptable and or have not even reached out to the community, I'm not interested in that. So my checklist is simple. Give me the scope of your project. Have you talked with your community that it will be impacting, okay? And have you garnered their support? And are we talking about working on a great compromise for the community as well as yourself, particularly in a highly gentrified neighborhood? We want to make sure that the community is at the table. So I think that that's important. But, you know, those who want to cut the state reps off, just remember, when you go to that state agency and you have challenges, you're not going to have a friend because they don't know anything about it, okay? And you're on your own. And I think that's problematic.
I already covered some of this, but I'll just touch on the bills that we're looking at or the issues that we're talking about. One is the right of first refusal, refiling that. The PFC property tax exemption, that's obviously getting a lot of attention, but I do think, you know, there may be an effort to file a bill that kind of rolls back the property tax exemption, or perhaps create some other mechanism or some other balance for those PFC deals. So we'll see what happens. I know that there's a lot of housing groups that are interested in that. Late fees, there was a bill passed by TA, the Apartment Association last year that affected how you calculate rate fees, that has kind of had a detrimental impact for public housing authorities. We're talking to them about their willingness to consider a bill that would take out potentially PHAs or maybe modify it in some other way. And then risk management, because of RAD conversions, some properties have a hard time getting the kind of insurance they need. So we're looking through that and seeing what modifications could potentially be made at the state level. Touching on a few of the big things that the state is working on. I mentioned passing a budget. That's really the only thing typically in a given year that the state needs to do. Number two, there is redistricting. After every census, they have to reapportion the districts, and that also needs to be done, but they don't have to pass a bill to do that. There may be, you know, some court activity. You know, trying to figure out how to navigate this process is becoming very difficult. You know, as I said, typically you start the second Tuesday in January and you run through the 140 days. And any special sessions come after that. Now, because of COVID, access to the building, you know, how do you staff up? How do you have hearings? You can't have those members sitting right next to each other. Maybe you got to put plexiglass in between them. You know, so what you hear is things like, you know, lobbyists can't come to the Capitol, or they can come after having their temperature checked. You know, you can come in the building if you're going to testify, but you can't come in to just go lobby. You know, maybe they do something off campus and lease some space to do remote hearings. Certainly, I would predict no advocacy days. So we're going to have to look at different ways groups like Texas NARO can be effective, because I think the likelihood of coming to the Capitol and lobbying is going to be pretty small. Maybe only the local bills or consensus bills that are important. You know, maybe those are the only ones that get heard. Maybe they only get heard in a few key committees and the rest of the committees really don't have that much to do. Maybe they even come in January and just, you know, pass a few rules, elect a new speaker, start the budget process, and then adjourn and stop the clock on day 10 or day 20 and come back in June or July and pick up the ball then over the summer and run through the rest of the session then. You know, all these ideas are under consideration. None of them have been settled on. You know, the fact that the speakership could change, you know, if it's a Democratic speaker, they might have different ideas about how to proceed than a Republican lieutenant governor. So you might have different rules in the House and Senate. So we're keeping an eye on all this. We're talking to legislators and trying to get a sense of how best to proceed. So here's
Well,
Barbara.
first of all, I'd like to say that navigating through this process is going to be difficult for everybody. You know, one of the great things of being a legislator is being able to have that one-on-one communication with your colleagues, and/or hearing those interest groups come to you and having those face-to-face about initiatives that they want to pursue. Everything is up in the air. The good news is the House is trying to work on ways in which we can communicate. Will there be public hearings? Will people be able to have large group meetings and things like that? And we don't know the answer. But here's my recommendation and my suggestion. As we become more technology-based, what I see us doing is using technology more. And so we've got to improve that infrastructure. So it's important that we communicate via email, via Zoom, Google Meets, whatever we use as our format. But I think it's important that we continue to do that because we have to hear the words and the voices of the interest groups and the people. So I would say to Naro is, let's not worry about that process because we're going to find ways to meet with you, hear your issues. It'll be many, many more emails sent, you know, many more packages sent for projects and things like that. So we want to make sure, though, that we as a society don't stop doing the good work that we do. And we're not going to let COVID be a barrier to us. Again, it's a challenge that we're going to turn into an opportunity. And we want that opportunity to help us communicate in better and different ways. So I'm really looking forward to it. And I wanted to add too, you know, as a legislator, we're looking at, are we going to separate desks? Are we going to put plexiglass? How do we, you know, log in for roll call? It's just many things that we have to determine. So in working together, hopefully we can come with what's best for everybody. And also that we can continue to meet with our constituents to hear your issues and to work through those issues. So I don't see it being a major problem. I really don't, especially as I've looked at our local public schools, how they've transformed. So if they're able to transform and they have the volume that they serve in terms of parents as well as students, then we want to make sure that if they can turn around, we as an agency can turn things around and navigate through this technology space that's going to be new for us.
And I'm not going to let Bobby talk a little bit about CARES Act funding that they've received.
The big pots federally that came to us. Well, first of all, we got more LIHEAP energy assistance and more community services block grant. So that those are pretty flexible anti-poverty funds that go to a network of community action agencies. And so, you know, in addition to our regular yearly allocation, it's like another year scrunched in. And so we're trying to get that money out the door. And that's something that I think is especially helpful now because people are having trouble, not just with rent, with their utility bills and whatnot. Those come from U.S. Health and Human Services. And then our big HUD money buckets that we got in CARES Act are additional amount of ESG, emergency solutions grants, which is homeless activities, and CDBG, which community development block grant. It's a little different than your normal disaster recovery CDBG. The mission was a little different, so that's why we got designated rather than GLO, who's still very busy spending their Harvey money. So what did we get? We got like 103 million of 143 million ish of CDBG, and a little under 100 million of ESG. CDBG has been kind of on hold as the state looked at the coronavirus relief fund money that we personally don't have, but other agencies do. And what else is coming from Congress? And then where are our holes? What are our needs? And so I've been pushing to use CDBG for rental assistance. I think that's a dire and growing need for certain folks, especially as unemployment, the Department of Unemployment Insurance expired. We have some of these eviction moratoriums that were expiring. Of course, now we have the executive order, but as I try to explain to others, that even in no evictions or delaying an eviction tidal wave doesn't solve the problem. Rent still needs to get paid. There's operating expenses, management. People have mortgages to pay on these apartment complexes. So it's a chain reaction of bad things that can be solved by putting some money, into the tenant for him to be able to pay, he or she be able to pay rent. So I hope to have approval on using some CDBG for rental assistance. Also, some of it earmarked specifically for eviction diversion. We're working with the Supreme Court on. We're looking to also fund some legal aid via request from the Supreme Court, Governor's office, to help people navigate these waters. So, tenant protection, tenant rental assistance. Those are kind of some of the big ticket items that we're going to hopefully program real soon.
Just to give you a sense of the timeline here, November 3rd is the election. Bills start to get filed November 9th. So the process starts right away. And then December 13th is when they stop raising funds. And there's a moratorium that runs through session. Certainly would predict session would begin in January 12th. That's the second Tuesday in January. The 60th day is when they stop filing bills. At that point, they just consider bills. They don't file new bills. And then the predicted last day of session would be May 31st. I feel certain there'll be at least one and probably multiple special sessions. So we'll have that to contend with. This is Barbara talking a little bit about affordable housing after 2021.
I think that in the 2021 legislative session, okay, we are going to see everybody receptive to changing things. And so I'm hopeful of that. I think a lot of times that people shy away from affordable housing because in their minds it have a negative connotation. And that is, people with vouchers and people that don't take care of their property. As we become more sensitive as communities and neighborhoods and as legislators, we've got to be able to change that negative perception to more of a positive perception and also change the name affordable to workforce housing. And so we're saying people that are working need to stay in decent housing. They may not make a lot, but they still are entitled and their children are entitled to stay in decent housing. So I think a good marketing program, a good vetting program, and targeted toward those individuals who have some hesitations. I've seen the NIMBY, not in my backyard type syndrome, but we've got to educate people a little bit more. I think that's one thing. The other thing I believe is important is that we educate people. I'm a big proponent of walking people through understanding the value of some of the things that we do and how that helps communities and that helps people. So I'm gonna take it upon myself this legislative session to really target those legislators that have some concerns about affordable housing and see if I can educate them to a point of understanding, number one, the need. And we're gonna need it more now than ever before, because we already know that the job market will be down from what it is. We already know that people's incomes are gonna be less. And so there's a lot of factors that will impact people as a whole. So we as leaders in our community, we owe it. We have a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that folks can live in decent, affordable housing / workforce housing.
I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here because I'm a little bit worried about time, where I think we're a little bit over, but some of these issues I know that they've touched on, and I'm happy to make this available. Oh, there it is. We're kind of coming to the end. This is your folks that work for you. This is me and my team. Katie does all the scheduling. Courtney is our legislative director. She maintains all of our schedules, keeps the trains running on time. And Stacy does a lot of media production for us. I hope you're getting the Friday newsletters. They don't always focus just on housing issues, but they do talk a little bit about everything that's happening at the Capitol on a variety of topics. And then, of course, during session, we'll have a focused newsletter that only talks about the housing issues that legislators are considering. And you're eligible, you're welcome to have that as well. I thought I'd pass along a couple of final thoughts here with Representative Gervin Hawkins as well as Bobby, just kind of talking about getting in touch with them, and then we'll conclude.
I'd like to really talk about affordable housing in a way that's different than ever before. I think affordable housing has to be looked at as a value to the community, not as a negative. I think it's important that as our PHAs, along with our development partners, as we look at putting together workforce and affordable housing, that we begin to look at the individuals that we bring to those developments. And we look at how we bring them a quality of life that they may never have unless they live in quality environments. And we all have to admit, our environment plays a role on how we think, how we act, and who we become. And if we create better environments for our children and those in need, we will have a better society. So I want us to hold our head up high. And for those folks who talk negative about it, we change them around. We get committed to that, to get them to see the real value in making sure that not only the people around them, but even their relatives and grandparents are able to live in quality housing. So I want us to do a great marketing program that says workforce development housing is the way to go. I also want to make sure that our state agency understands that when the needs of the people are there, we want them to be responsive. I believe there should be more dollars put in multiple family housing developments. I believe that needs to be the case. The demand is there, the will is there, and we as the state of Texas should make it happen. Thank you.
Oops, jumped ahead. I know that Barbara mentioned it to me about, and Gene and I talked about the legislative committee. I think we're going to try and put together maybe a roundtable with some of the PHAs and Barbara and maybe some others to talk a little bit about housing issues leading up to the session. So as that effort gets underway, we'll keep you in the loop. But I do think that that would be a great opportunity for Texas NARO to kind of be communicating with legislators going into session. Here's Bobby wrapping up.
Well, Eric, thanks for me. I appreciate it, and appreciate Texas NARO wanting to see an interview of me. But I'd like to meet more of the leadership at these PHAs. First, met, of course, Mike Gerber in Austin and such. But I'd like to meet, leadership from large, medium, and small PHAs to hear their perspective, how they feel that they're interacting with the department, and their ideas on housing, what they feel are the obstacles and the assets that we have in the state. So it's hopefully something we can continue in the future, and it's the beginning of a longer conversation. And Eric, for those that are wanting to get in touch with me, you can always reach me at bobby.wilkinson@tdhca.state.tx.us.
And Bobby expressed to me a couple of times wanting to visit with PHA leadership. So I think that would be a great opportunity for us to kind of expand the visibility of Texas NARO as well. Wanted to share a little bit about my information. This has got my phone number there. I got a new address in Austin, my website, of course, and my email, and for not just me, but everyone that works for me. So we're your team. We're here for you, and anything that we can do to be helpful, please feel free to reach out to me directly or contact Gene. Gene's never shy about putting me to work. But I want to be your liaison at the state capitol, educate those members about the value of what it is you do, and please, let me know how I can be helpful to you. And with that, I'll stop sharing. Hopefully you've had a chance to write that down if you need it. And if there are any questions or comments or concerns that anybody wants to raise, I don't know how much time we have left, but I'm happy to be available.
Hey, Eric, this is Lisa Garcia from Austin Housing Authority. And I just had a question as we move forward after the election. What do you think the next steps are in terms of, in coordination with Gene, that Tex Naro should be doing to influence this next session?
Thanks, Lisa. I do think, as I mentioned, Barbara, and there was a couple of others, we don't know who's going to be chair of the House committee, which is, unfortunate. But I do think that Barbara and there's others who are eager to do this. And I think the time is right for us to start to reach out to them. So what Gene and I spoke about yesterday or a couple of days ago in the legislative committee is, kind of initiating that outreach and seeing if there's a group of housing authority leadership that could meet with Barbara and maybe some handpicked legislators, as well as possibly a separate meeting with Bobby to talk about, what we see coming, what we see as our challenges. CARES presents pretty significant opportunities. Gene identified a couple of places where, with some modifications, maybe those resources might be more valuable to PHAs in terms of hiring, people who can help coordinate benefits or what have you. So I think, evictions and rent supports and educational and economic opportunities, I think that's what that CARES Act money is meant to do. And a lot of it is still sitting in the governor's office. Over $5 billion of it hasn't been allocated. It needs to be by the end of the year. So I think there'd be a good opportunity for us to say, here's what we see as needs, particularly economic needs for PHAs and the residents. So that is what, after this week, I'm going to work on getting those set up probably sooner with Bobby, since he's not facing a re-election challenge. Barbara and others, it may have to wait until after November 3rd when they get through their races.
Thank you. And thanks for putting together this presentation. I think it was great. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Other questions?
Anybody else? Anybody have any other questions for Eric?
All right.